In 480 BC, a small force of 300 Spartans and 700 Thespian soldiers defended the pass at Thermopylae against a Persian host of 200,000. Outnumbered 33-1 by their Persian opponents, the Greeks held for 3 days before that unstoppable force crushed them. 2,345 years later, a small force of Confederate soldiers defended the approaches to Petersburg for 3 desperate hours against an equally unstoppable force, the Union Army of General Ulysses S. Grant. But, unlike the story of the 300 Spartans, the story of these 334 soldiers of Robert E. Lee's army is virtually unknown. By the end of March 1865, the sun of history was setting on the Southern Confederacy. The Union Army was barely a mile from the suburbs of Petersburg, Virginia, the last major obstacle keeping the Federal Army out of the Confederate capital of Richmond, which lay just 20 miles to the north. Defending Petersburg and Richmond was the vaunted Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee. Lee's 57,000 ill-fed and ill-clothed soldiers were defending Petersburg and Richmond against Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant's army of 125,000. Grant had trapped Lee the previous June, and the rebel army was being bled white, trying to defend over 40 miles of trenches, forts, and strongholds that had been dug around the two cities. During the 10 months Petersburg had been under siege, Grant had slowly extended his lines south and west, cutting first one supply line after another that linked the city to the rest of the South. Soon, only the South Side Railroad remained. As the federal vice tightened around Petersburg, Lee realized his men were too few to defend the Petersburg line for much longer. Lee informed the government in Richmond that Petersburg was doomed, and when Petersburg fell, so would Richmond. The Confederacy's last forlorn hope was for Lee to abandon Petersburg and Richmond by way of the South Side rail line, evade Grant's clutches, and escape south to link with Johnston. Then their combined force would hopefully defeat Sherman and then turn back north and defeat Grant. Grant anticipated such a plan and determined to cut the South Side Railroad by sending General Philip Sheridan's Cavalry Corps and infantry of Gouverneur K. Warren's 5th Corps on a wide sweep to his left to the road junction at Five Forks. Lee, outnumbered over 2-1 in the Petersburg area, reacted as usual. He dispatched a combined arms force of 10,500 infantry and cavalry under Generals George Pickett, of Gettysburg fame, and Fitzhugh Lee. Lee's order to Pickett was terse: hold Five Forks at all hazards. The rebels initially pushed Sheridan away from Five Forks to Dinwiddie Courthouse to the south. But as Pickett pushed southward, he created a 4-mile gap between his force and the rest of Lee's army entrenched at Petersburg. Sheridan and Warren found this gap and planned to exploit this error by pushing infantry into that gap to cut Pickett off from Lee and destroy the isolated Confederate force. The attack was set for the morning of April 1st. Warren, though competent, was slow to get his corps into position, and as the day progressed with no action by the Federals, Pickett and Fitz Lee left their command to attend a lunchtime shadbake. Leaving their commands in the face of the enemy was inadvisable to say the least. Leaving their commands and not informing their respective staffs where they were going turned out to be disastrous. Late in the afternoon, Sheridan began a diversionary attack while Warren's 6,000 infantry headed for the gap and began to overlap the rebel left and pour into their rear. Under fire from Sheridan in front and Warren from the rear, the Southern troops began to panic. But Pickett and Fitz Lee, 2 miles away, were blissfully unaware that anything was amiss for 2 hours. Due to an atmospheric anomaly, the sounds of the battle could not be heard. It was only when Pickett was returning to his command and witnessed a courier being surrounded and captured by Yankee troops that he became aware of what was happening. By then it was too late. Warren and Sheridan had destroyed his command as a fighting force, and Five Forks was in Union hands. The news must have stunned Lee in Petersburg. In just a few hours, the entire right wing and 20% of his army was crushed. Nothing stood between the Federals and the capture of Petersburg and its bridges over the Appomattox River. If the bridges fell, the Army of Northern Virginia would fall with them. Lee took immediate action, firing off a message to General Longstreet in Richmond to send the nearest unit at hand to Petersburg immediately. Longstreet ordered Major General Charles Field's division of 4,600 to march at once, but could not hope to march the 15 miles to the Petersburg defenses and be in position until around 7:30 a.m. the next day, April 2nd. The news of the Union victory at Five Forks sent spirits soaring at Grant's headquarters. The siege had been broken and the end was in sight. Grant ordered a general assault along the entire Petersburg line for 4:45 a.m. on April 2nd, almost 3 hours before Field's division could arrive to man the defenses. The Federal assault began just before dawn on April 2nd, with the greatest artillery bombardment of the siege, and within a couple of hours, Lee's lines west of Petersburg had been breached in several places. The Union 6th Corps shattered the thin Confederate fortifications and crossed the Boydton Plank Road, then the South Side Railroad a mile further on. Lee's escape route southwest to North Carolina and Johnston had just been cut. The 6th soon linked up with John Gibbon's 24th Corps and advanced toward General A.P. Hill's line in Petersburg itself. As the Federals advanced, Generals Longstreet and Hill were conferring at Lee's headquarters when a courier rode up hard to inform them that Hill's line had broken and Federal skirmishers were approaching. The Confederate situation was now desperate. With the South Side Railroad cut, the only way to reach Johnston now was to cross the 2 remaining bridges to the north bank of the Appomattox River and head for the Richmond and Danville Railroad 35 miles away. But first, the Federals had to be kept out of Petersburg until nightfall, because only then could Lee attempt to disengage his troops from the pressing Yankees and escape across the Appomattox bridges unmolested. Fortunately, there were strong lines of defenses in place on the west side of the city, but there were no troops to man them. Field's 4,600 men, who had been set on the road the previous night from Richmond, were beginning to arrive to fill the trenches, but the Union 6th and 2nd Corps were also racing for the same line. Longstreet needed to keep the Federals out of Petersburg for at least 2 more hours to position Field's troops. Directly in the path of the Union advance were 2 earthen forts, Fort Gregg and Fort Whitworth. On the shoulders of the defenders of these forts would rest the survival of Lee's army. General Cadmus M. Wilcox's division held this critical sector, and he directed Generals Nathaniel Harris and James Lane to gather their Mississippi and North Carolina brigades and any others nearby to occupy and hold both forts. At Fort Gregg were approximately 150 men of the 12th and 16th Mississippi, 80 from the 18th, 28th, 33rd, and 37th North Carolina, and 40 from the 14th, 35th, 45th, and 49th Georgia. This tiny force was bolstered by 2 artillery pieces and around 64 artillerists from the 3rd Corps. The 334 men of Fort Gregg would be the first to face 2 Federal corps. Fort Whitworth, 700 yards north of Gregg, was defended by about 200 men. Between 12 p.m. and 3 p.m., 2 divisions of Gibbon's Corps, some 4,600 men in 5 brigades, launched 5 assaults on Fort Gregg, each wave consisting of 5 to 6 regiments. But the defenders, veterans of the Holocaust at Spotsylvania, were prepared. Private Frank Foote of the 48th Mississippi recalled that each defender had 2 or more rifles at hand, and while the rear rank loaded them, the front rank handled them with most deadly execution. A Confederate soldier, D.M. Rigler, in a post-war letter to General Lane, described what he witnessed. The enemy commenced charging with 4 or 5 lines. We did not fire until they came in 40 yards, and then we gave them 1 deadly volley. They then wavered, and the first line gave way. The second came forward and came in 30 yards of the fort. We yelled and fired. They stood a few seconds and then broke. Their 3rd line retreated also, but their 4th and 5th lines came to the ditch around the fort. While this fighting was in the front, 1 line came in the rear and almost got inside the fort through the door. About 20 men charged them and drove them back. 5 waves of Federals had advanced only to be repulsed. Finally, Gibbon called upon a reserve brigade to join in the attack on Fort Gregg, and now 4,000 Federals began surrounding the fort and scrambling up its steep sides to overwhelm the Confederate defenders. Eventually, the flags of 6 Federal regiments were seen on the parapets, but still the rebels fought on. Wounded Confederates in the fort gathered rifles and ammunition from the dead and continued loading and passing them to the defenders on the walls. Captain Jones of the 16th Mississippi remembered, as before the last assault was made, the battle flags of the enemy made almost a solid line of bunting around the fort. The noise outside was fearful, frightful, and indescribable. The curses and groaning of frenzied men could be heard over and above the din of our musketry. Savage men, ravenous beasts. Then the Federals finally spilled over the parapets and into the fort, and hand-to-hand fighting broke out. One of the two Confederate cannon was out of action by this point, but on the south wall of the fort, the remaining piece of the Washington artillery from Louisiana remained in the fight. A 21-year-old private from Louisiana, Lawrence Berry, was the number 4 man and had just primed the Napoleon cannon and grasped the lanyard when a group of Union soldiers rose up on top of the parapet. The soldiers leveled their muskets and commanded, "Don't fire that gun! Drop the lanyard or we'll shoot!" Berry hollered back, "Shoot and be damned!" and yanked the lanyard. The Napoleon, loaded with a double charge of canister, roared, sweeping every Yankee in its front off the wall. Enraged Union soldiers riddled Berry with musket balls. Finally, after 25 terrible minutes, the horror sputtered out as the sea of blue soldiers swamped Gregg and the surviving rebels dropped their rifles and surrendered. It was 3 p.m. Lee had needed 2 hours. The men of Fort Gregg had bought him 3. Sadly, several Confederate survivors reported that some Union soldiers, sickened and angered by the carnage, bayoneted or shot a few surrendering rebels. To their credit, Union officers threatened to shoot their own men to regain control. A New York soldier entering the fort described the scene inside. The interior of the fort was a pool of blood, a sight which can never be shut from the memory. The rebels had recklessly fought to the last. An officer of the 39th Illinois recalled, "When we rushed over the top, the sight was truly terrific. Dead men and the dying lay strewn all about, and it was with the greatest difficulty that we could prevent our infuriated soldiers from shooting down and braining all who survived of the stubborn foe." Inside the fort lay 57 dead defenders and 243 wounded or captured. Only 33 men surrendered unhurt, and 1 managed to escape the fort before it fell. Almost 90% of the Gregg defenders were casualties. The Federals suffered 714 dead and wounded in the attack. Another 97 would succumb to their wounds in the following weeks, bringing the total cost to 811. 14 Medals of Honor were awarded to Northern soldiers who assaulted and captured Fort Gregg in a testament to the valor displayed in the desperate fight. With the fall of Fort Gregg, Fort Whitworth was now indefensible. Lee ordered the position abandoned, and the defenders made a desperate run under fire to Longstreet's now fully manned inner defensive line. The rest of Lee's final defensive lines stabilized also, more due to the exhaustion of the Union soldiers than to the strength of the defense. As night approached, William Hopkins of the 7th Rhode Island wrote, "Thus closed that wild, stormy Sabbath, a day of blood, carnage, and victory." That night, Lee disengaged his army, crossed the bridges over the Appomattox, and began the race to Appomattox Courthouse, hotly pursued by Grant and Sheridan. Lee would lose the race 7 days later when he's cut off from the Danville rail link to Joe Johnston and surrender the Army of Northern Virginia. An English observer noted, "In those 9 memorable April days, there was no episode more glorious to the Confederate arms than the heroic self-immolation of the Mississippians in Fort Gregg to gain time for their comrades." Epilogue. After the war, James Lane, Nathaniel Harris, and Cadmus Wilcox argued in the pages of the Southern Historical Society's magazine as to who rightly claims the glory of the defense of Fort Gregg. Noah Andre Trudeau's Out of the Storm, Ronald E. Bullock's article Last-Ditch Rebel Stand at Petersburg, on HistoryNet.com, and Time Life's Pursuit to Appomattox, all describe the makeup of Gregg's defenders as follows. Approximately 214 Mississippians of Harris's brigade, and a handful of North Carolinians of Lane's brigade. However, the letters to Lane papers, in possession of Auburn University, paint a differing picture, namely that Lane's North Carolinians were in the majority at Fort Gregg and deserve the lion's share of the credit for its valorous defense. The Lane letters, written by the defenders themselves, claim that instead of the 214 defenders listed in the above sources, the actual number may have been as little as 125 to 150. They go on to state that Harris's troops numbered only from 10 to 25, and that Lane's brigade forming the largest portion, 75 to 80 defenders, ably assisted by 20 men from a Georgia unit and 25 to 30 artillerymen. The number of 334 defenders in this video are from the book The Confederate Alamo Bloodbath at Petersburg's Fort Gregg on April 2, 1865, by John J. Fox III, Savas Publishing, 2010. I've included a link to this book in the description and can also recommend Out of the Storm by Noah Andre Trudeau. Thank you for watching. I hope you'll consider subscribing and liking, and will return soon to American Civil War facts.